I think Mr. Schadenberg's remarks invite Dr. Schuklenk back to give a 5-minute rebuttal. I'd just like to remind you guys that if you do have questions, to fill out the slips of paper that you were given when you walked in, and to pass them along to the sides. Someone will be by the collectors to make your question gets asked. Thanks.
Yeah, can you hear me actually? Is it working, yes? All right, okay. As I expected, we would be bickering about the interpretation of facts as opposed to the ethics of things which I'm qualified to talk about. However, given that Alex has a habit of repeating the same arguments everywhere, including on his website, I have prepared myself a little bit for the kinds of arguments that he just shared. So let me quote the researcher of one of the studies that he has just referred to, which was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2010. He wrote an email to me. He says, I'm the researcher who gathered the data, and he saw Alex's stuff on his website because I asked him to look at it and tell me what he thought about it. And he says, I'm the researcher who gathered the data he's basing his plea on, and it pains me to see how some of the data are misused. Specifically, the question of life abbreviation without explicit request, right? They are presented as an ominous development since legalization. In fact, the incidence of these practices has halved since 2002 in Belgium. In Belgium, actually, decriminalized assisted dying. Most probably, as the patients in similar situations increasingly request and receive euthanasia, or were at an early stage of terminal disease given intensified treatment for pain and symptoms, including continuous deep sedation. In this argument here, they're all lumped together as endangering patients and it's ethically objectionable. The author Alex neglects to explain the methodology by which the data and end-of-life decisions are obtained in the Dutch and Belgian death certificate studies, which is necessary to understand the significance of reported epidemiological results. Because it may signify different things for different people. The term euthanasia does not appear in the questionnaires. Rather, the physician who assigned the death certificates are, in strict anonymity, asked whether they have administered drugs with the intention to hasten death, a technical definition of life ending, and next, whether this was at the request of the patient. Then follow many other questions on the characteristics of cases, including whether the case was reported to the Control and Evaluation Commission. So the death certificates of lower cases and of unreported versus reported cases of intentional life ending have shown actually that lower cases are never reported to this commission because physicians do not consider them as ending life. This is the reason why they don't report them, not because they have something to hide. The vast majority of these cases concern the compassionate abbreviation of the agony of dying. Unconscious patients with high doses of opioids. It turns also out to be the case that 41% of these patients had previously expressed the wish of life abbreviation. And I could go on now. Suffice it to say, these interpretations are in serious dispute. That is what the heart of the problem is. We will not be able to agree on this unless you actually look at the studies, and this was said, please look at these studies. Don't take our word for it. What I want to do though is I need these 2 minutes. I want to quote to you, again in the same context, the same studies in response to the Lancet study that he mentioned last. An editorial in the Lancet, not written by the authors of that study. And I read, and I quote, after a decrease shortly after the legislation was passed in 2002, the frequency of euthanasia in the Netherlands has indeed increased to 2.8% of all deaths, that is slightly above the 2001 level though. The frequency of physician-assisted suicide has been stable, abuse has not been widespread, and there is no apparent disproportionate use in vulnerable populations. Physicians do not substitute hastening death for the provision of palliative care. Instead, they intensify the alleviations of symptoms. Much more often than they undertake euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And the increase in the alleviation of symptoms is also much steeper than the increase in euthanasia. In fact, today, this is also true for Belgium, by the way, physicians grant fewer than half of euthanasia requests from patients. Today, in Belgium, the percentage points of euthanasia cases is 2%. We're not talking about the deluge of people that are being euthanized in any of these countries. And these figures actually, despite ISIS claims to the contrary, have been fairly stable over time. Or some, but it's bad now. So now we had, just to the moderators, we had this for them back for the next hour?
No.
Alex has a 5-minute
Oh,
rebuttal.
I didn't need to accept it.
For the question period, we can give you each a handheld mic and Julian will share the mic.
How do we get questions in the crowd? They each have a hand.
We just forward it back to them, each other.
Okay, in fact, the interesting thing you mentioned last editorial in the Lancet, and I very much disagree with the editorial in the Lancet because it didn't actually represent the numbers that you see in the study, and I pointed that out. You see that in reality the numbers show an increase in euthanasia deaths in Belgium. In fact, the most recent numbers just came out showing another 25% increase in the reported number of deaths, and they're now saying it's around 3%. So, whether we're talking 2 or 3, you would say it's been, saying it's been rather level is not correct. The question of Lauer is very important, though, because Lauer is deaths without request. These are deaths that happen to people who never requested it. The importance is the law requires that the request must be explicit. And if the request is not explicit, then it would be enacted outside of the law. My point is sort of clear to you that how many deaths are we willing to accept that are not requested, that are outside of the law? My argument is sort of simple. I'm not saying that everybody in this world has to worry about deaths without request, or that you will be killed by a physician or something like that. That's far from being my argument. In fact, my argument is that some will be, and how much is that considered acceptable? Is it acceptable that your life gets taken from you without your request? This is what we're coming down to. When we're talking about voluntary euthanasia, I'm suggesting clearly that voluntary euthanasia is only something that happens in many of the cases, but not all of the cases. So therefore, we're putting another group of people in direct risk. This group that is people who were comatose, people who had dementia. The study that looked at that, they actually had a bit of a response to that study. You already mentioned, we noticed it. We both noticed it. There was a response to the study, and there was a response then back by the authors of the study recognizing, because someone questioned the numbers. They're saying, how could this be? All these deaths without request and that sort of thing. And the response was, in fact, well, these were not explicit requests, and the law requires explicit request. The other thing with the nurses study, someone had questioned the numbers on their nurses study, and that was also in the CMAJ. And the response by the researchers were that the information was accurate. My point also goes further. There's, as much as we had the decision in Carter in Canada, the Irish appeals court has also just the Irish court just recently also dealt with the same sort of data, and you're laughing, but they came to the opposite conclusion. They said, in fact, there is significant sign of abuse going on in these nations, and of course, it's unacceptable that they would not be legalizing Ireland. Now, of course, that decision's been appealed too, and it will be one to the appeal process. Nonetheless, I'm suggesting to you that in fact it's a part of human nature. There's always going to be some people who are going to take the law in their own hands. If you legalize euthanasia, you will have more deaths going on than fewer deaths. The question of the idea that there's actually half the number of Lauer deaths, means deaths without request, no one requests that they die, half the number of them after legalization. Well, the whole idea of legalization is argued, well, then we have some rules now, we can control it, you don't have to worry about this. But in fact, it's not the truth. It doesn't happen that way. And if you look at the other numbers, which are very interesting out of the Netherlands, it's a huge number of deaths that were related to terminal sedation and large doses of morphine. Now, I don't consider it necessarily the same thing, but you see this massive growth in the use of terminal sedation. The question is has the idea of terminal sedation then become just simply accepted? Because in fact, right now in our culture, it's somewhat of an extreme thing. It's not always done, because it's usually only done when somebody actually has intractable pain. And I'm not saying that it should only be done for intractable pain. I'm saying that tends to be the case. But in the Netherlands, we're seeing these huge numbers. So the question is once we've legalized euthanasia, does that affect the ethics and how we deal with other questions? And I would say yes. Some would argue further about issues of suicide prevention. And they will say, well, this doesn't affect other things within our culture. But in fact, if you look at Oregon, we notice that the suicide rate has actually gone up significantly, and they're now 35% higher than the national average in the U.S. The other side would argue, well, Oregon always had a high suicide rate, and I would say I'm not arguing that it didn't. What's happened, though, is it's been increasing ever since legalization of assisted suicide, so you have a suicide contagion effect. The stories used are very interesting because actually the video with Terry Pratchett with Andrew Cohen is very interesting, and his comment, quality of life is not acceptable. I think we have to be very, because we're talking about personal feelings in one sense, that's correct. But we cannot separate our personal feelings from what happens within our own attitudes towards others in society. And so the fact is the Council of Canadians with Disabilities are opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide. And they have a fear that because of attitudes that already exist within our society, that their lives will be treated with less respect, because others will say that they actually lack quality of life. By making the judgment for yourself, in some ways, that transcends to your judgment to other people's lives. Sorry, I didn't notice your hand. I'm very sorry about that. And we could go for another 20 minutes, but we're not going to.